I think the perception that people have of Portland is Portlandia. You know, Portland markets itself as a progressive city. You cannot have Portlandia without having a brutal history of repression of people of color. So I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a free state. And the reality is much more complicated.
When Oregon became a state, it didn't become a slave state or a free state. It became a no blacks allowed state, and it was the only state to do that.
That same law that outlawed slavery also included the Black Exclusion Law that said that Black people were not allowed to live in Oregon. And it included the Lash Law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months up to 39 lashes until they left the state. So Oregon outlawed slavery and outlawed Blackness while threatening to torture Black people publicly until they left. The language banning Black folks from Oregon was in the Constitution until 2001. That was not an oversight. It was not, oh my gosh, we forgot, how embarrassing. It was a conscious decision again and again and again. Because again and again, the Black community came to Oregon and said for decades, please take this language out. Please tell us this is not the kind of state you want to live in. And again, Oregon reinforced, actually, this is exactly the kind of state we want to live in.
We have new details on a deadly attack in Portland.
The FBI is looking into possible hate crime charges against a man accused of stabbing 2 men to death aboard a train Friday in Portland, Oregon.
He is seen on surveillance camera yelling racial and anti-Muslim slurs at 2 teenage girls on a commuter train before stabbing 3 Good Samaritans who were trying to stop him.
It made perfect sense to me that sort of violent racist behavior was going on in Portland, and that it had led to this.
It's only a matter of time before this stuff turns into violence, so I'm not surprised, really.
I was absolutely not shocked. We live in Portland every single day, and we see the mask that Portland puts on for the rest of the world, and we see that it is paper thin, and we have to look under it every single day.
One thing that many people don't understand about Oregon is the importance of the Ku Klux Klan. So the Klan in 1923 was the largest Klan west of the Mississippi. And if we think about, the issues that we're facing with white supremacy today, they didn't just happen, right? The white supremacists didn't just decide in the 1990s, oh, let's come to Oregon and see what havoc we can raise. Of course, there's a direct line from white supremacists today through to the Ku Klux Klan, right back to 1844 to that first exclusion law. Until the Second World War, it was actually a small number of Black people who lived in Oregon. There was nothing here for them. It wasn't a very hospitable place.
The entirety of Portland was closed to Black people. So these thousands of Black folks who were coming had no place to live. So Kaiser said, well, I'm rich. I can build myself a city. And that's exactly what he did. It became the second largest city in Oregon, and it was 40% Black. But Vanport was never supposed to be permanent. In fact, the Housing Authority of Portland already started making plans to demolish Vanport before World War II was over. Folks in Vanport actually organized to keep Vanport as a community. And they were fighting until 1948, which is when the dam broke and Vanport was literally washed away.
My name's Ed Washington, and I moved here to Vanport City, Oregon in 1944 when I was 7 years of age. My family moved here from Birmingham, Alabama. On the day of the flood, I was standing up right about where that light pole is, probably. And I can remember seeing the first big wave of water after the dikes gave away. I saw it. And then probably 10 minutes after that first wave, there was another huge wave of water that came in. And after that, these houses, they just, we knew we weren't coming back.
Houses floated off of their foundations, and almost nothing was left of Vanport.
And there were people on top of roofs, and there were animals on top of roofs. And there were people in the water. I couldn't swim. I would have drowned. I mean, we had to start over from scratch. Everything. Cooking utensils, everything.
I think it's incredibly important in that story that the morning of the Vanport flood, the Housing Authority of Portland distributed flyers to every house that said, "Don't worry, the dam will hold, you're fine, you don't have to go anywhere, you're safe." Meanwhile, the night before, the Housing Authority of Portland had packed up all of their files and taken it out of Vanport because they knew that there was a huge possibility that the flood might come.
You said it took under a year to build.
Yeah, a little bit over, about maybe right on a year, just a little hair under a year to a year to build.
How long did it take to be washed away?
About 45 minutes. Yeah.
The reason that Vanport could be bought and built on unincorporated land was because it was a terrible place to build, because it was basically a basin, it was a bowl, and there was marshlands. It was basically, it was a flood waiting to happen, and the dams were not properly built. It wasn't properly protected on all sides either. So the official number is 17 people dying, I believe, but the folks who were there say that many more people died and that was covered up. But it did leave close to 17,000 people houseless, and that is even more disproportionately Black. And that became very important because, some of those Black folks left, but many of those Black folks moved to Portland proper. And the very strict segregated lines had to be expanded to accommodate those folks. And that was the first time that Black people in Portland had a large enough population that the city of Portland felt like they had to listen to Black interests, or at least give the impression that they might be listening to Black interests.
I think it was the addition of all those people that came here to work in the shipyards, and after the flood, they stayed. And so, therefore, things would have to change. I mean, this city probably had more to do with the changing of attitudes toward African Americans and other people of color than any other area in Portland.
It's an incredibly important piece of the history because it is the largest migration of Black people into the state.
Is there anything marking that this was once Vanport?
There's a historical sign that there is there, and where we're going around, there's another sign. But other than that, no, most people come here and play. There's a golf course here now, and there's a raceway, and most people just come to the car races and come to play golf, and they have no idea. When I do those tours with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, a lot of people says, "I'm surprised, I've been here, but I had no idea that this was Vanport." Yeah, that is. Nothing left here but memories. But you can't take people's memories away from them, can you? Can't take that.
When the flood happened, it flooded out that area, so they moved, and the city does this, okay, we're gonna put you guys here. Then they came through and put a freeway through, and that displaced the neighborhood for the first time. It moved north. And then later on, the Emanuel Hospital got permission to expand their campus. And of course, they wanted all the African Americans out from around the hospital area, so then we were displaced again. So we kept moving north and north. And so now that the area that we're in right now, it's called the Albina District. They call this the hippest part of town because gentrification set in and people wanted to move in. If we didn't own this building, we would not be able to stay here. When I got here in 1963, there was almost 100 African-American businesses. Today, I could take you around, I could show you 5. The people are gone, the businesses are gone, because they're spread all over, pushing them further and further and further out, because that's the only place they can afford to live, where the rent is reasonable enough that they can survive. I've been living in this area for 50 years, and now you go in a store, you see nobody like you, and you feel like a stranger. you know, to walk in.
We don't have like one neighborhood really anymore where it's like this is where the black people live, which is good in the sense that white people have black neighbors, but it's also negative in the sense that we don't have representation of a black community that exists anywhere.
There have been many, many ways that the black population of Portland has been deliberately kept down. And I think it was just fertile ground for white supremacy. So Mulugetta's apartment was 212, which is this one, sort of behind this tree. What you need to know is that this is the skinhead apartment. You need to know where the skinheads were coming from when the fight occurred. The Park Lane apartments were so close to the Pine Terrace apartments that had they wanted to, Mulugetta Serra and Nick Heisey could have rigged up an old-fashioned tin can telephone on a wire between their two units or thrown pebbles at each other's windows. So Mulugetta and his friend and another friend went to a party, came back and pulled their car in the opening, the courtyard, and were sitting in the car talking. And the skinheads, they come up the street and their cars pull up side by side, and that's when the shouting starts. I think it started politely with "move your car," but at a certain point, the skinheads realized that the people in the other car were black. And that's when the racial slurs started. And Mulugetta got out of his car to go in, motioning to everybody to calm down. Mulugetta was, by all accounts, a very sweet-tempered young man and a peacemaker. The fighting broke out between some of the others down there, and then he had run down to get into the fight, and it was at that point where, I mean, I shouldn't say to get into the fight. He might have run down to stop the fight, but he was in the fight. And that's when Ken Miske grabbed the bat and killed him. The neo-Nazi element was particularly shocking. Even though it seemed that these would be total strangers, it turned out they were very, very close at hand. Kyle Brewster, the second person in the car, had been the homecoming king of Grant High School, which is one of the major Portland high schools. And his mother was a well-known liberal activist who knew a lot of people that I knew. And Steve Strasser really lived very close to where I lived then and live now. So all of a sudden, these people they weren't somewhere else, and they weren't somebody else. They were neighbors or acquaintances. People were surprised, they were shocked. They acted as if Oregon were not, in fact, an extremely racist place. I mean, my favorite thing, I really will never forget this, it was I think she was still governor at the time, Barbara Roberts, perfectly nice liberal woman. She was at a rally, she said, "Racism is un-Oregonian." Okay, nothing could be further from the truth.
This is what Oregon has been doing since Oregon existed as a state, and it is in the DNA of Oregon. Oregon can't put this on someone else.
USA! 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 No Trump! No KKK! No fascist USA! Get up!
Since the inauguration, people from Washington and Southern Oregon come to Portland to rally in support of free speech or Donald Trump himself. And what that has resulted in at first was smaller counter-protests, which grew to large, huge counter-protests. You know, we don't want to promote a brawl in the street, like let's line up who's red and who's blue and let's fight it out. But rather, if you are a part of a marginalized community and you see that these fascist people are coming to Portland and marching, that can be incredibly detrimental to your confidence in your own city. But if instead you see that your city came and showed up in numbers to say, no, that hate is not what we stand for, and we are going to stand for love, and we are going to continue fighting for the most marginalized people in our community, that can be incredibly empowering and positive to those people.
What real conversations are. If someone comes and talks to you, and cusses at you, and yells at you.
You hang out with bigoted pieces of people like and you promote them and you allow them in our spaces and in your space.
They've been coming down
under
here.
Your banner.
They've been coming down here into Portland
you
forever.
You are them.
They think this is weird. This is a family, okay? This is a family. They love each other. Okay, they survived out here. This kid's holding a Bible, and he's holding a gun, baby. He's holding a gun. That is America. That's what I cherish. That's what I love.
Why do I think white supremacy is a problem in Portland? Because white supremacists are here. And white supremacists are taking advantage of the numerical imbalance that's here. And I don't see white supremacists loading up their trucks heading for Southside Chicago. It wouldn't last very long. It wouldn't last very long at all. The engines wouldn't even get cold before it would be all over.
Oregon is a racist utopia. And so communities of color have to understand our different experiences, but recognize that we are fighting the common enemy.
He and his friend were walking by. They looked up and saw our sign, and it says Iraqi food on the sign. And they said some racial slurs and F Iraq, and they had a seat at a table right actually here. And they sat and they didn't order any food for quite a while. You can see in the footage that it looks and it feels like they were looking for a reason to show some anger. Rodriguez is kind of looking around and he feels a couple different chairs, decides on one and picks it up and just hauls off and hits our staff member as hard as he can and blows himself over with the force of having hit our server.
And that night I feel really sad, and also I just want to know what the reason. Dar es Salaam, it means house of peace.
You know, growing up as a white person in Portland, I wasn't experiencing the negative effects of racism so much. I wasn't aware until I got older of how prevalent it really is in our city. And, you know, we have a child together, and it's very much Iraq is a part of my life.
Our daughter, she's 3 years old, and I don't want her to be shamed because her father Iraqi.
She's hearing us talk about this incident, and yeah, she's had a few questions.
Today, I think a white supremacist blends. It's like camouflage. Like growing up, you see the kids with the laces, you see the people with the bomber jackets. You'd be like, oh, that's a skinhead. But now, yeah, I mean, you really can't tell unless they're, you know, throwing a slur at you. There's really no way to look at someone anymore and be like, oh, that guy's racist.
You know, maybe the rest of the country doesn't know, and I think they do need to know, because I think that's the only thing that's going to make it change. I think people in Portland know about it. What I really think needs to change is people in Portland, you know, denying it. I mean, like, no, there's not, like, you know, white supremacy here, and there just is. Like, it's on the streets.
You've been a law enforcement officer in Portland for decades. Can you talk to me about the history that the city has with white supremacy and skinheads, and do you think that they're still around now? Do you think they're gone?
Oh yeah, they're around. They're around. I'm not sure that we in law enforcement in the state of Oregon give them enough attention. We give a lot of attention to specific gangs in our city. We have task force, we have units for those teams. I'm not sure that we do the intelligence or have the information or track the crimes correctly that are dealing with bias and prejudice, intimidation, harassment, assaults that are related to a person's race, their religious base, whether they're LGBTQ, but we have these things that occur and we go, well, how did this happen? But when you do the follow-up, you find that this has been happening with this individual and now they're acting out. So do I think we need to do a better job? Yes, I do.
Only talking about the street violence of white supremacy will not make communities of color safe. I think that we absolutely have to address the street violence of white supremacy, but if it disappeared tomorrow, if all of the neo-Nazis and all of the Klansmen disappeared tomorrow, the material conditions of people of color would not change markedly, because it is the police who are enacting this violence, it is the healthcare system that is enacting this violence, it is the educational system, the criminal legal system that is enacting the everyday violence that is literally killing our communities. And so we have to see that this is a spectrum. They work hand in hand.
That history, it doesn't wipe away with, now I'm not racist, so that history is gone. Those people built a system in an establishment that worked for white supremacy. So until we realize that this system is working for certain people and it's working the way it was designed, it's not broken. That's how our system was designed. Until we break down that system, it's going to continue to be that way. But to do that, we need people that hold the power and hold the privilege to be aware of that system.
We all came together and we wanted the story of Vanport being told. We can't fight for what we want to fight for in our community if we don't understand the core essence of the histories.
In Portland, during the period of 2000 to 2010, 16,000 primarily black residents got displaced out of one area in the city, which is the only area that locally Portland has ever allowed black folks to live. Wow. And then now they put them out of that space.
You have to have the political will to want to make a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable. And you need people like me who are going to, use their voice and use what influence we have to call to action. So if we're not going to do that, there is no reason in the world for us to be in these positions if we're not going to stand up for our most vulnerable.
We just don't want to talk about what Vanport was, but we want to revive it. No matter what socioeconomic background you come from, there's one thing that can bring all people together. It's music.
Tell people it's like being black.
Ooh. Damn, that's a good question.
As soon as your individuality or your uniqueness shows, you're an item and not a person. You're a entity and not just like an existence. It's like you are the trend right now, so I'm interested. That's what being black is like in Portland.
People love our culture. They love our music. They're posting Snapchats, rapping, but as soon as, one of us gets killed, they don't say anything. So it's like, where are you at when we're getting choked out? Where are you at when we're wrongfully accused? Or looking like someone else and we get shot down? Like, where are you at then?
That mentality shouldn't be a thing. Like, millions came out for the Women's March, but when it's Black Lives Matter, it's literally like you're blocking traffic.
Yeah.
All lives do matter. Great. But can you also just agree as well that Black lives matter? Because I'll definitely say white lives do. I'll definitely say any lives matter at all. The fact that you're countering me is the problem.
Right. I was just gonna say that. Like, you don't have to be black to be at this march, but if you understand what we deal with every single day as being a black male or black female, be there, be a part of it, stand for something. Like, it's easy just to march when it's convenient.
Or say something.
Or say something,
even.
yeah, like.
But it's not even, we can't even get to the conversation of like, why aren't you here? Because we're having the conversation of why we're there.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, and that's the biggest problem.
Yeah.
And that's the large lump sum of it all.
Do you ever talk about this stuff with your music?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wrote a song called Black Magic Woman that was specifically about giving back power to Black women.
People just need to be aware of what's going on. It's one thing to listen to the music, and it's another thing to understand where we're coming from as people, black people in a predominantly white city.
The city of Portland is a great place to live. No one should take that away. But when you talk about race, it's very interesting what happens sometimes. People either will talk about it or they won't say anything that they think is inflammatory.
Sometimes quietness and not saying something when you see something wrong. Sort of, if it's not a form of racism, it surely encourages.
If people are aware, and if people stop acting like, I don't see color, don't give me that, don't tell me that ever. It's real, these things do happen. You know, this place isn't as happy-go-lucky as you thought it was.
Are things getting better? I don't really know if they're getting better or not. I really don't, but I know that they're heating up.
This direction of these ideas or these movements from the fringes, which they were, to the center, from the little music clubs in Portland, I mean, to essentially the White House. That's a huge reality of American life. And where Portland fits into that, that is the most important thing.
Portland is in a debate with itself. We're comfortable with slow, progressive change. Hold on a little bit longer, things are going to be all right. The time has run out for slow and progressive change.
There is a movement that, whether you call it white nationalism or white supremacy or neo-Nazi, and that is growing. That was exemplified by what happened in Portland, and that is not secret anymore. It's not undercover.
I think that it is incredibly important to see communities of color as leaders, as active change makers, and not as passive victims. The racial justice that has happened in Oregon, in Portland, in this nation, in this world, has come from the determination, courage, resilience, and bravery of communities of color. And they have made the world better for all of us for it.
It's like, who do we want to be? How do we want to be remembered? And I want to be in a history book, and I want to be somebody that, when they're writing about their thing, came and stood up for justice.
The demographic in our communities that's standing that way, that's promoting that, are very young, very intelligent, very determined, and they already know that the inheritance of leadership and the inheritance of everything is theirs.
You know, when you're running a race, the hardest part is the very end of the race, because everything you've had, you've given up a portion of it to get almost to the end. So just keep on keeping on. Have to.